In 1969, along the frozen borderlands of Manchuria, the two largest communist powers in the world almost turned the explanation of brotherly unity into a full-scale nuclear war. Zhenbao Island, the Ussuri River, dozens dead. Mao Zedong and Leonid Brezhnev no longer had any way to call each other because the hotline had been cut. Yes, while the USA and the Soviet Union kept their hotline after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the two communist nations cut communication like a couple that had just broken up. And this isn't a poetic metaphor. This is the perfect recipe for disaster. The question is, what would have happened if these small skirmishes escalated into an all-out war? Would the Soviet Union seize Manchuria, or would China bury the Red Army in snow and starvation? And most importantly, what would the world look like today if these two communist giants decided to settle their dispute with nuclear weapons? Let's begin the simulation. First, to understand why this conflict almost happened, we need to understand the background. The Soviet Union and China were once close allies, but by the late 1960s, that relationship had completely collapsed. Mao was displeased with Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin, believing Moscow was following a revisionist path and betraying the revolution. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union viewed China as a rebellious, illiterate younger brother, and, worst of all, one that was trying to steal the leadership of the communist world. On top of that, China demanded the return of 1.5 million square kilometers of territory that Imperial Russia had taken from the Qing dynasty in the 19th century. This wasn't a dispute over a few uninhabited islands. This was about national pride, geopolitical power, and something both sides understood implicitly. Whoever controlled this border would control Asia. In March 1969, fighting broke out on Zhenbao Island. Dozens of soldiers on both sides were killed. And for a brief moment, the world stood on the brink of witnessing the first war between two nuclear powers. Brezhnev even considered a preemptive nuclear strike on China's nuclear facilities, but he backed down, fearing U.S. intervention. So, the question is, what would have happened if Brezhnev hadn't backed down? For this conflict to escalate into total war, we need a spark. In real history, Romania refused to sign a statement condemning China at an emergency Warsaw Pact meeting on March 17, 1969. Nicolae Ceausescu, the man talented enough to turn Romania into the only Warsaw Pact nation daring to defy Moscow, cost the Soviets their unified support. But in our simulated world, let's assume Ceausescu decides to sign. The Soviet Union now has official backing from the Warsaw Pact, and that alone is enough for Brezhnev to feel more confident. At the same time, imagine the clashes on Zhenbao Island escalate just a bit further, with the Soviets refusing to withdraw and launching a strong counterattack. Mao Zedong, who was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution and needed an external enemy to consolidate his power, declares war. And there we have the formula: a disputed border, two stubborn dictators, and no hotline to resolve misunderstandings. Perfect for disaster. Now comes the interesting part. How would this war actually play out? First, forget the image of millions of soldiers marching across the border. The terrain here, ladies and gentlemen, is the greatest enemy of both sides. The Amur River, the 10th longest river in the world, freezes for half the year and is nearly impossible to cross during the other half. No bridges, no infrastructure, just ice, snow, and vast emptiness filled with nothing except -30 degrees cold. History has shown us this. In 1900, when tensions rose between Russia and China along the border, the Russians forced 4,000 Han Chinese to swim across the Amur River in the middle of winter. Most drowned or froze to death. This is not ordinary warfare. This is war against the terrain. Therefore, don't expect massive battles with millions of troops. Instead, this will be a war of air power, long-range artillery, and small-scale clashes at a few choke points where armies can actually cross the river. In the first months, the Soviet Union would dominate. Why? Because they had around 7,500 combat aircraft, while China only had about 3,000, most of them outdated models from the 1950s. China's radar was bad. Their pilot training was even worse because the Cultural Revolution had devastated the military education system. The Soviets would dominate the skies, bombing military bases, destroying supply lines, and paving the way for the Red Army to cross the river. In March and April 1969, when the Amur River was still frozen, the Soviets could march across in large numbers and capture border cities like Heihe. But when summer arrived, the river thawed, and suddenly Soviet forces on the far bank became isolated. Supplying them became difficult. Air supply was possible, but not a sustainable strategy. And this is when China begins to strike back. Mao had one advantage the Soviets did not: manpower. Millions, tens of millions of people. Mao's strategy had always been quantity over quality. In the summer of 1970, China mobilizes millions of soldiers, floods Manchuria, and begins to push the Soviets back. This is when things become dangerous. Brezhnev now faces a choice: accept defeat or escalate. And historically, the Soviet Union did indeed consider using tactical nuclear weapons. In our simulation, let's assume Brezhnev decides to press the red button. In the autumn of 1970, the Soviet Union drops 10 small nuclear bombs on military targets in Manchuria and Xinjiang. Not major cities, just military bases, weapons depots, ports. The result? Chaos. Millions of Chinese civilians die. Millions desert. The Soviets seize Manchuria and Xinjiang. But then the world erupts. The United Nations condemns the Soviet Union. NATO threatens intervention. India, once a supporter of the Soviets, cuts ties. Eastern European countries begin to rebel. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary all see massive protests. The Soviet economy, already stagnating, now collapses under sanctions and the strain of prolonged war. And then China responds. They drop several nuclear bombs on Siberia. Vladivostok may be hit. The world now witnesses the first nuclear war in history between two major powers. By 1971, both sides are exhausted. The Soviet Union is completely isolated. China is devastated. And finally, under pressure from the international community, a peace treaty is signed. The Soviets withdraw from Manchuria. Xinjiang is returned to China, although in a devastated state. But the damage has been done. The consequences? The Soviet Union collapses 20 years earlier, around 1975, instead of 1991. The Warsaw Pact disintegrates. Eastern Europe is liberated early. NATO expands rapidly. Communism collapses worldwide. China never becomes the economic superpower we know today. No iPhones made in China. No factory of the world. The United States enjoys 30 more years of uncontested dominance. And here's the strange part. A war between America's two biggest enemies ends up being the greatest gift Washington never asked for. The Soviet Union and China destroy each other, and the U.S. just sits back, occasionally sends some weapons to China, and enjoys victory without firing a single shot. The modern world would be completely different. No rise of China. No Taliban, because the Soviet Union never invades Afghanistan. Possibly no 9/11. Russia would be far weaker, perhaps never daring to annex Crimea. Vietnam might unify under the South. The world would be far more unipolar, with the USA as the unrequited superpower. But of course, this is only a simulation. In reality, Brezhnev backed down. The hotline between Washington and Moscow did its job, and the world avoided disaster. But the fascinating thing is this. For a few short weeks in March 1969, the world stood on the edge of a scenario so insane that even Hollywood screenwriters would consider it too wild to put on film. Two communist allies nearly destroyed each other with nuclear weapons, and the only reason they didn't wasn't brotherhood, but because Washington was sitting there, smiling and whispering, "Go ahead and fight. We'll support whoever is losing, just to make the war last longer." That is the essence of Cold War geopolitics. Ladies and gentlemen, there are no brothers, only power.